Today, we're going to be talking about one of the most dangerous and divisive threats that we face today, disinformation. And we are going to be talking with the DisInfoGal, so stay tuned. Hey everybody, this is Chris Brandt. Welcome to another FUTRtech video podcast. Now, we have all been inundated with bizarre theories, angry memes, obviously wrong facts, and friends and family members who seem to be lost in their strange beliefs. Today, we are talking with disinformation educator and consultant Lindsey Alexander, who is best known as DisInfoGal across YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and the rest of the social media world. Lindsey started out her career with the FBI and then later moved on to the CIA, where she focused on Russia and the near abroad. Now Lindsey consults with businesses on how to identify and deal with disinformation. So we are going to pick her multilingual polymath brain on what we need to look out for and how we can defend against it. Welcome, Lindsey.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for being on. I got to say, I am really excited about this topic, and I got to say, I love your social media stuff. I think you're doing a great job of, promoting the cause of, defending against disinformation. You're educating a ton of people. You're educating me, and I love that. I love to tune in. And lately, you've been doing a lot of lives and helping people parse the whole Russia, Ukraine, and China, Taiwan issues, and I think people are very fascinated about what's going on. But today, we're going to be talking about disinformation, and all that plays out in these other things too, but we want to talk about disinformation. So I'm not sure everybody even understands what disinformation or misinformation is, and if there's a distinction between those two things.
Sure thing. And first off, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here. There is a main distinction between misinformation and disinformation, and that is intent. With misinformation, that's simply false or inaccurate information, and sometimes it can be spread with an intention to deceive, but usually not necessarily. But with disinformation, that is blatantly like false information spread with the intention to mislead, to manipulate a targeted audience to commit a certain action. And most of the time that disinformation is, originated or created by organizations or government entities, and is then spread to convey a certain narrative for a particular action.
Who are the main actors spreading disinformation, right? I mean, you talked about like major actors, but who are they?
Historically, it's been like major government entities. You have various countries in the West, and then you do have Russia and China really have created the bread and butter of what we know as disinformation. They're unfortunately very good at it, and they are the main foreign actors that are working on spreading it. However, I would argue going into the future, we're going to see not just government entities get more involved in spreading and creating, but private sector entities as well, because we've seen recently how profitable this can be, sadly, and how easy it can spread on social media. So that demographic will be changing in the future.
You talk about the corporate, there's a certain corporate espionage piece potentially in this. And I know beyond that, there's just misinformation is so widespread. There was a CEO in Utah recently who was, going off about, genocide through vaccines and, spouting off about all sorts of, conspiracy theories. And, they had to shut him down and get rid of him right away because it was causing, significant damage to the business. So I think, there's a lot of angles here that business needs to be concerned about.
Oh, I agree. Not just, that particular incident, but also who they're doing business with. And are they doing due diligence on those other entities, individuals, companies, making sure those individuals aren't involved or susceptible to disinformation, and as well as everything down to even advertising. I work with some clients now, making sure their advertising isn't appearing on websites purporting disinformation.
Yeah.
And that's another thing that can, impact the bottom line. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of potholes in the road for people around this
Yes.
topic for sure. So now we're talking about like what is disinformation, and I think we've historically always known about propaganda, and many countries have utilized propaganda, the U.S. included. But it seems like it wasn't until, the rise of the social media platforms, and in particular Facebook, that we just saw it just so incredibly weaponized against a population.
I will add that there has been that greater shift between using really propaganda and disinformation, because I think not only foreign governments and other entities have noticed that propaganda only goes so far. Disinformation can actually create movements. It can influence people to vote, not vote, support initiatives, actually create that action, and also create funding and financial incentives for those spreading it. So disinformation seems to be leading it, especially on social media, just because you can share something with a click of a button in a matter of seconds. That piece of disinformation is going to, spread itself and impact, hundreds and thousands, millions of people within seconds. And that disinformation is created to spread faster than, factual information, because it will draw a strong emotion from you. It will be more appealing in its regard and very attractive, and you're going to want to share it. And it'll be either strongly funny or fearful, or cause you to be angry about something, to really, get that information spread faster. And without knowing it, you might have just shared it and caused a whole belief system really to be created.
Yeah, I think there was, I can't remember who, there was a quote about, a lie can travel around the world in a second. The truth takes its time, or something like,
Yes.
I think it was some Winston Churchill quote or something about that. So one of the things, you talked about is, like sort of this kind of emotional response. And, what, when we're looking at like, what's the purpose of what they're doing? I mean, obviously that, they're evoking emotions, trying to create movements and things like that. But like, what's the overall objective that, they're trying first to get out of the people that they're, attacking with disinformation, but then what is the end goal for the perpetrator as well?
A lot of it really depends on what that overarching goal is for those that are creating it. When you're talking about foreign actors like Russia and China, and if using that as an example, and them targeting the United States or Western countries, their goal specifically with Russia tends to be to create chaos, to create division, and to cause uncertainty amongst the group. And also to cause doubt in various elements as well. And so with them, to create that division and chaos and whatnot, which they are, seems to be working, they do that by creating some sort of doubt in like societal institutions. So their disinformation, as we have seen recently, is targeting various societal institutions. You create that doubt, and then that causes, chaos, inner fighting, and more conflict and tensions build up, and then that country can become like weakened, and so that purpose, like for Russia as an example, their purpose would be to see, not only a weaker United States or weaker Western front essentially, but that will also give them the chance to see where the West and all that entails, where their vulnerabilities lie, and what it takes to really cause like a nation to like crumble essentially, like not going that drastic right now, but kind of, where those tension points are, and it brings those to the surface. And not to mention there could be financial gains in there as well.
It's interesting. I mean, when you talk about that and you think about like, the attacks that Russia has, misinformation, disinformation attacks that Russia has, waged against the United States. And now we look at this Russia-Ukraine situation, right? And I think you can see how that chaos plays out in our politics, because there is incredible disunity, especially and particularly on this issue, with people, some people in our government taking Russia's side in this, which is, unimaginable, 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, even maybe. And even among NATO partners, I mean, you see there's some disagreement with Germany and, other folks. So, I mean, it seems like it kind of worked. Would you say that that's what's happening there?
Yes, as much as I hate to say it, I do think because with Russia, just using the United States as an example, we have been so focused internally on our domestic issues for the past few years in our domestic, like
turmoil,
insecurities. Yeah.
Chaos.
The chaos internally here. That's a good way to put it. And so, and focused on just everything internal that we missed, or many missed, what was going on externally. And Russia took advantage of that. And then, currently with what's going on with Ukraine is considering and continuing to take greater advantage of that, as well as we've seen like the various narratives coming out and a lot of public information about what's going out. And a lot of it is confusing, like you said, and drawing sides and causing people to support something they might not have supported, or who they might not have supported had they not been exposed to certain disinformation. And it definitely has worked.
Yeah, and I think you made sort of the distinction between propaganda and disinformation earlier, and I think it's interesting because propaganda is something that's sort of maybe a one-way channel, right? Whereas the disinformation seems to be constantly amplified and magnified by the people who are subjected to it. I think that's maybe is that how you would sort of draw that distinction? Because it seems like just all they have to do is just plant a seed and then it just explodes. Everybody does the work for them. I
agree. And with disinformation, it's just more insidious because it tends to attack people at more of a moral level, and where they're insecure and where they might lack specific knowledge, it tends to just find its way there. And it's that's why I keep saying it's insidious, just because of the behavior that it has. And that's where it can then spread from there and garner more support.
When we look at disinformation and trying to figure out how do we identify disinformation, what are the key things that people should look out for?
I will start by saying something that might sound discouraging in a way, but it's important to recognize that the more sophisticated the disinformation is, the harder it's going to be to recognize. And I think everyone needs to understand that going in. And just because it doesn't show right off the bat that it's disinformation doesn't mean it's not. I mean, history has told us that sometimes it took years to determine if something was disinformation. We're still 100 years out from a famous Russian disinformation campaign and still figuring out what was parsing through that alone. But I will say in certain aspects, it is becoming a little easier because there's more awareness of it. And with that, what I tell people is there's a few ways you can tell or take a step back to see if what you're looking at might be disinformation. And the first thing is checking to see if everything you're seeing within that piece of information is factual and goes together in a factual, coherent way. Because sometimes they'll put a fact in, but then use false information and kind of buffer it. And so that's why you have to look at each piece. And then is that creating a strong emotion? That's a very telling sign. If you're feeling a strong emotion, whether that be anger, fear, humor is another one, strongly. And if it makes you almost want to share something immediately or take an action following that or call your representative or things like that, that's when you need to take a step back and look at it further and then look into the sourcing, the transparency, what other reports are out there on it, and if that information really can be trusted with that source.
It's interesting because, we see it coming, from so many different angles, right? I mean, and we see there's a few bad actors, and it's not, I think we kind of, the narrative around a lot of the disinformation discussions, which, in some ways could potentially be disinformation as well, is that it's sort of limited to one group and not another. But, I see it happening on both sides, because like you said before, it's about creating chaos. And how do you create chaos? You stir this group up, and then you stir this group up, and then they go at it, right? I mean, is that what you're seeing?
Yes, 100%. Like, I know there has been in the past few years a stronger contingent of it on a certain political spectrum, or targeting a certain political spectrum, but there's also been one on the other side too. And I think people forget that they think it can't happen to them, or that they're smarter and won't fall for it. I know I've sat in that category too, and everyone has to recognize you can be exposed, you're going to be exposed to it, and you just have to recognize ways so that you mitigate whether or not that exposure is going to be effective on you. And so, and it can happen no matter if you're on the right side of the political spectrum, in the middle, or on the left side. We have seen, historically and even now, there's a pendulum where it kind of will target heavily one side, and then it'll slowly move to the other and kind of just swing back and forth. I personally think right now it's swinging back and forth. Mm-hmm. And I've seen it on both sides, and the left side is starting to pick up a lot more to match kind of the right side as well. And so just people have to be aware that that's coming down the pike, and we'll be seeing that in the next few years too.
Yeah. I remember hearing Alex Stamos talking about disinformation maybe a couple of years ago, and one of the things he said is that, because coming from the big Facebook provider, like that, and how do you target and identify this disinformation? He said there's two things that make it really, really hard. One is that it's not always inaccurate information. Sometimes it's factual information that's presented in a context that evokes an emotional reaction. Mm-hmm. And second of all, it's not all done by outside actors. Some of it's coming from domestic sources, right? And so being able to, in bulk, identify it is a really hard problem to solve, right?
Yes, it is a very hard problem. And you have the target audience, which is the vast majority, in the United States, the target audience is the vast majority of the American people who don't, disinformation is a long word and it sounds complicated. And so they don't know, there isn't that education there about what it is and what it can do. And that's taken advantage of, unfortunately. And I think a lot of people just feel like they have that ego, it can't happen to me, I'll be fine, it'll be obvious, because they go straight to, it's more of the extreme stuff that no one would believe, when normally it's not. It's some of that, but it's also, like you said, they'll put a lot of information together. And I think I remember hearing him say that. And when they do take, and I should correct myself, when they take factual information, it's incoherent when you read it together. And we're seeing a lot with the COVID stuff. So they'll take, a zebra has stripes, an elephant has tusks, and then a panda is a bear. They all live in Kentucky, and they eat grass. Yeah. And they'll put it together like that. And it's just, there's not really, it's not coherent, doesn't make sense. And some people believe it. And that's even more deceptive as well. And so I could ramble on things that you can do to help mitigate that. But that's a lot of what we'll be seeing and have seen internally too.
Another aspect of it too is that I see, just clearly not, disinformation sources providing disinformation, because you'll see it in the way that social media works. It encourages, hyperbolic sort of headlines and thumbnails and things like that to attract audiences. So I get really frustrated when it's like sources that I think are providing good information, but it's like so and so crushes somebody or destroys, and it's all in all caps, or and it's like, to me, that's an element of disinformation too, right? Because it's trying to get that emotional reaction, but which makes it so insidious.
It does. And having that sensational language, I know a lot of news sources try to do that to get clicks now and to get likes and whatnot. And that's going to make it harder to actually identify the disinformation. And because you can see that come through almost any like news source and then any other source as well. And it does come in many mediums, and that sensational language can be, written down. Like saying strong and stuff like that, or it can be spoken in a video or
Yeah.
in a meme. I mean, so many different mechanisms there.
I like what you said about, I think, the evoking an emotional reaction, because that's what I'm kind of trying to look out for, is like, when I read something, do I instantly have sort of an emotional reaction? And the thing that's crazy about it, it just drives me nuts, is I understand what they're trying to do to me. And I read it, and it still does it to me. I can't, disassociate from that. It's really tough.
Yeah, and it's because it probably you have confirmation bias in there too.
Yeah.
So you're going to get a strong emotion, and it's going to confirm something that is a bias that you may know you have or don't know you have, and it's going to support whatever that belief is, and then it'll get you suckered. And I think like right now, with like the pandemic and stuff, that's happened a lot with individuals. And that's why you kind of have to take a step back if you're getting an emotional response and just breathe and then, proceed further. Yeah.
It comes to sort of the next point, and I know you mentioned that, there's some ways to defend against some things, but how do we defend against this? Because it seems like a really Sisyphean sort of battle here.
Yes, and I know it can feel like overwhelming and exhausting, and it's like so much information coming at you at one time, and then so few resources to actually mitigate it. And I feel that too, like every day, like, holy cow, it's almost impossible. And that's what disinformation wants, like the creators of that want you to feel that way. And feel like it's impossible, because that just makes you more apt to believe it and give into it. And so what I advocate for like the general public is just increasing those education initiatives on like media literacy and critical thinking, and being able to identify like opinion versus fact, and just basic things like that. And also like emotional learning, understanding, what's, bringing that emotion out of you, and what your biases are, and where you're ignorant and in a good way, and trying to explore those. It's like a lot of self-reflection in that, and self-awareness. And then, electing better people in office that will, work towards building better regulations and legislation on like foreign influence operations, which disinformation is a huge part of, and trying to find ways to regulate it, without violating constitutional rights and whatnot, but finding a way to do that. And I recognize there's a chicken egg situation there with, you need a better educated populace to do that. And it's a long road, but I think being aware and doing that. And I will say, for businesses, it is important to be aware, because this is a new thing for startups. And I work with small businesses, recognizing that disinformation is a threat coming down the pike. It's already here, essentially, that will impact a business's brand and bottom line. And recognizing not only that, but identifying ways that you can be aware of it and work towards, mitigating that as well, is going to be really important.
You mentioned a whole lot of interesting things in there. It's just sort of the emotional piece of it, and like the media literacy. I mean, like in critical thinking. Like I think I look at the sort of the American population, and like teaching them media literacy and critical thinking. That's a big one. I mean, what do you think? How do you think that gets solved? I mean, is there a way to solve that?
Teaching it at a younger age in schools, because I know I might be dating myself, but I didn't have like a critical thinking class until like high school. But I know in elementary school, there was a few of us that would be taken out and like the gifted and talented program, and they would teach stuff like that there. But that's like, I have issues with that, but that should be taught at like kindergarten and to everybody. And talking with my friends in education now that teach those levels, unless the teacher preferences that and wants to teach it, it's not necessarily being taught like at that lower level. And starting there so kids understand it when their brains are still like molding is very important. And then also offering critical thinking and like media literacy classes to adults, and finding clever and creative ways to get that to them, whether it be like a TV show or a fun book or just something, a video game, an entertaining way to do that is really important and would make a huge difference now. And at all levels, I think, broadening that out is good. And yeah.
Yeah, I remember when I was a kid. Now I'm, we talk about dating oneself. I'm going way back, but I remember I used to read Mad Magazine all the time, and it was sort of a counterculture, but it taught a lot of skepticism. As much as people were like, "Oh, those drawings are terrible and the stories are awful," and blah blah blah. There's a lot of blowback against that. But I did look at start when I was reading those. They do parodies of commercials and stuff like that, and it was like, it started to be look at it a little bit more skeptically. Just the little things, I guess, can help out.
I agree, and reaching them in different mediums, because right now you see a lot of like critical thinking and media literacy being brought to people in like PowerPoint presentations and things that aren't super exciting. No dissing on like people doing that, but we need them in like video games. We need them where the kids are, fun things in the apps. And I'm not a kid and I don't have kids, but whatever is reaching that demographic and age, and same with the older generations, and having it adapt is like one of the better ways to like reach people on those basic level skills.
Since you're specializing in like corporate America, trying to help companies with disinformation and consulting around that, where does it belong in the corporate world? Chris and I kind of were chatting about that. He felt like it was more like a cybersecurity kind of a role within an organization, which I didn't really think about it like that as at first. I thought maybe it was more of like an executive level kind of a thing, more of like a social media, maybe even marketing kind of thing. I don't know. But like, since you're the expert, where does that belong in the corporate world? How should it be governed?
I have actually seen those elements in both of those areas. And I think it needs to be in both of those areas, because it utilizes like that cybersecurity aspect, but then also like that public affairs and social media and marketing aspect. They need to be aware of it as well, because they're really on the front lines of dealing with that. And so recognizing how to respond when encountering disinformation is going to be a little different than responding to, normal like negative feedback or a negative brand and reputation situations.
What we used to call that in the sales world was FUD, F-U-D, for fear, uncertainty, and doubt. You know what I mean? And I feel like, so when I've been having these conversations with you and Chris about this topic, that's what I'm thinking in the back of my head is the amount of disinformation that happens at a very tactical level, like at the field level. It's where one company is misrepresenting what they really do and how they really do it, just for a sale or their brand or whatever it might be, image or whatever. But that disinformation, and I don't know if it's just, in some ways it's just lying, and in some ways it's just maybe they are just bought into the BS. I don't know, but there's a lot of FUD that goes on in the corporate world, for people's own objectives. So anyways, it was great to get your opinion on that. The other question that I had that's kind of scaring me in the beginning of the conversation that you guys were talking about with like Russia and China, how much, and I don't even know if this is measurable, how much of the disinformation is targeted towards the U.S.? Is it that we just have such big enemies and that's why we are susceptible to more of this? Or Is this going around everywhere? But we just, since we are a power in the world, we're just a big target because we have the influence that we have.
I think many countries deal with disinformation. I know like European countries in particular have dealt with like Russian disinformation for much longer than we have. And they're like, it's second nature almost there. And they have mechanisms there to deal with it. Their people are more aware of it, and it's not necessarily new. In the US, because some of us tend to have that mentality of it can't happen here, it can't impact us here. We're new at dealing with it. And so we're not only learning what disinformation is, but how to combat it and how it's going to impact our society. Like we are really dealing with it, not like necessarily now for the first time, but the past like century or so. Like the American people have really seen the impact that it can do. And so we're more of a target just because we're like the newbies in a way when it comes to that.
It just seems so hard to measure. You can't, how do you measure the amount of disinformation that exists?
Yeah, that's a good question. We have found so far like think tanks and whatnot are able to measure some parts of it like in real time. I know like Brookings and there's a few others that have measured it in real time, but normally it's historically looking back and seeing what all that disinformation was and kind of how it caused the people to, take certain actions and what that caused. I'm hoping that changes so we're not constantly looking back and wishing we had done something different or whatnot. But right now it's more of a looking back measure than it is a present measure.
One thing I also wanted to just touch on, I mean, there's, we don't use, for example, chemical warfare, but, like biological warfare and things like that are kind of taboo in general because, it comes back and bites you. And my understanding is that, a lot of the disinformation, especially around vaccinations and things like that, that was applied to the United States has kind of come back and bit Russia a bit too, because they had just a tremendous amount of vaccine hesitancy within their own country. Do you see like a lot of, because it seems like a lot of what's happening, like things that are just very American are all of a sudden erupting all over. I mean, like the trucker protest in Ottawa, they're Canadians with Trump flags. It's like, what's going on with that? That just seems strange. It seems like it's just leaking out everywhere.
Yeah, and there was a situation I know in Spain recently with Trump flags too, and it's the power of social media. And I know like with like Russia, it has dealt with like the boomerang effect with disinformation in its past pre-social media, and it doesn't necessarily, like many of us, we don't normally learn our lessons the first time. And so they dealt with it again with the vaccine, not thinking that boomerang effect, would happen again. And it did. And we're seeing a lot of like, I call them like solidarity events where like we had the trucker situation in Ottawa. I don't know if that's still actually ongoing.
I think it's still going, yeah.
It's still going. Okay. And we've had it a few areas in the U.S. too, and we saw this with other types of, protests and situations as well. There was a lot of anti-vaccine protests that started in the U.S. and then we saw them in Europe, Israel, and other countries throughout the pandemic. So social media connects people, and that's good and bad in certain areas too. And that's just something I think. Again, like, government institutions and societal institutions need to catch up with and recognize the fact and kind of adapt in their ways with that, because it's the reality. So how do we adapt and move forward within that scope too?
We just can't have nice things. I think that's
I know we can't. We cannot handle nice things at all. Social media is nice, but can't handle it.
Yeah, we can't handle it. It's way too much for us. Our little brains, our little monkey brains can't handle it.
Just get rid of it. Yeah.
So Lindsey, what's next for you? What do you got on tap?
So I'm working on, working with more small businesses and startups and whatnot on disinformation mitigation. I'm currently working on building a website as well. It's still in progress. And then I am writing a book and kind of in the early stages of that to help the general public like have a better understanding of disinformation and how to mitigate it themselves, because they're the major target audience. And so having that understanding is really important.
Well, and quite clearly, you're doing a tremendous Herculean effort to educate people on social media, which is, going right to the source, which I think is, really valuable. And, like I know, so you're disinfo_gal on
Yes.
TikTok, right? And is that the same on Instagram and YouTube?
Yes, and Twitter as well.
And Twitter as well. Oh, God, let's not forget Twitter. That's the original, the granddaddy of disinformation. Yeah, and then so if people, because I think I can even see just large enterprises needing to have a little bit of disinformation consulting, in their portfolio there. If people want to reach out and contact you, what's the best way to do it?
They can reach out to me on any of social media platforms, or send me an email at disinfogal@gmail.com. And it's one word for Gmail.
Okay.
And I will return your email.
I'm sympathetic to you because, what you're doing is a really hard thing to do. And you face down people who are, very confused, sometimes delusional, and you get, in some ways on social media, you put a little bit of a target on your back. And when you do these things, you have like all kinds of people coming out of the woodwork, so I applaud your courage and your effort in all of that.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate the support.
You're fighting a very difficult cause.
It's a noble
for
battle.
So many people.
It's a noble battle.
It's a very noble battle.
In fact, I think it's one of the most important topics that we've ever talked about on this podcast, because this is really the thing that it's almost an existential problem for the United States, and we need to get it under wraps. And I don't know that enough people are raising the red flags about it like you are.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I know there are some people trying to raise some red flags, but I feel like more people need to talk to the audience that's being impacted and like raise the red flags for them too.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you so much for helping educate us a little bit. And, thanks for doing what you do. Really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you very much. I really appreciate you having me.
Thanks for watching. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. And if you like what you saw, please give us a like. Think about subscribing. And I will see you in the next video.